Thank you very much. I very much appreciate and honored to have this invitation. I also will apologize that I don't speak in English, but that's my limitation. I guess that there's several things I want to say about American exceptionalism. First of all, it is an implausible idea. It is empirically wrong, and I will suggest ways in which it's empirically wrong. I think it has also encouraged a kind of arrogance that is extremely unhelpful, that can also almost allow the United States to operate as a rogue state. And finally, it leads to mistakes in foreign policy because it looks more at itself than the world outside of itself. And one of the things that some of us are trying to do in the United States now is to teach American history in a way, as has been suggested, to put it in the context of the world so that we understand how the dynamics of what we do and don't do may work. Anyway, Americans have long thought, and I think all people of all nations think, that their nation is different. A lot of them even think their nation is better, and certainly Americans do. That's prideful, but that's not problematic in the way that exceptionalism is. Difference and exceptionalism are two different concepts. There can be a multiplicity of differences, but exception is a concept that is the exception to the rule. It is against the norm. There can only be one exception, and that as opposed to many differences. We have a world of differences, but to claim exceptionalism is to be outside of the norm. That is where the difficulty emerges. That gives a kind of exemption from the norm. We're not bound by the general rules because we're not a part of that. We are exempt. Any kind of exemption is a kind of a privilege. This is a privilege the United States, particularly since World War II, has given itself. That, as should be clear, means that the supposed universals of international law or other agreed upon global commitments are things that are not always taken seriously by anyone who has the privilege of exceptionalism. The historian Daniel Rogers, a Princeton historian, a few years ago, identified the origin of this kind of thinking in American public life. And it comes very recently. It was in the 1940s that this emerged as a concept. I will just mention, if you want more information later, we can talk about it. The first usage of American exceptionalism as a specific term came from Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. I don't know if the conservatives who are so in favor of American exceptionalism like that lineage. At any event, the development of this reading of American history came right after World War II. There were two American historians. Well, one was a political scientist, the second one I'll mention. The first one is Daniel Borston, and the other is Lewis Hartz. Both in the 1950s wrote books from very different outlooks. Borston, who in the 1930s had been a communist, and then who in the McCarthy era, what is known as named names. Many communists refused, or former communists refused to name names, although they would admit their own situation. Borston named names. And in his post-communist and quite distinguished and influential career, ending up appointed, I think, by Ronald Reagan as Library of Congress, which is a very honorable position. Nonetheless, in 1953, while he was still a fairly young scholar, he wrote a book entitled The Genius of American Politics. And it was an exceptional interpretation of American politics in which he basically said there really isn't a politics. We just naturally are the way we are, and it all works well. A couple of years later, in 1955, Lewis Hartz, who was a political scientist at Harvard, wrote The Liberal Tradition in America, which is quite a brilliant book, actually. And he lamented the narrow Lockean consensus of American politics. He explained that the American liberal consensus, that means neither radicalism nor conservatism, was the result of the absence of an initial feudal order, which made America liberal at birth, and then but also with a very narrow spectrum of political conflict. I was actually, my first year in graduate school, I was assigned that book, and I was asked if this was a good argument for American exceptionalism, and I told the professor, well, I don't know, the Civil War isn't in the index, so you never know. Anyway, the animating text for exceptionalists that showed up in every textbook, every source book, every American history class in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was John Winthrop's lay sermon from the Puritans, a model of Christian charity, a sermon he gave when the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Interesting, neither Borston nor Hartz had any interest in this religious text, but it is the thing that ended up in textbooks. I will talk more about it. This text, along with Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, among some of his other framings of the Civil War, are most often claimed as the foundation and legitimation of American exceptionalism. In fact, none of these three texts actually make an exceptionalist statement. Both Winthrop's and Lincoln's voice were aspirational, that is, seeking to be the best we can be, which is very different. It may be arrogant, but it is not exceptional. In the 1970s, historians use of or even a debate about exceptionalism was rare, given the circumstances of the 1970s in the United States with cities burning and the Vietnam War protests. They didn't seem so exceptional. But the exceptionalism came back with Ronald Reagan, and it is now still firmly in the hands of the new right, neoconservatives, the evangelical right. Ronald Reagan's move into national politics was the occasion for a famous lecture that combined Winthrop and Lincoln in ways neither intended. In a lecture to the first Conservative Political Action Conference in 1974, Reagan delivered a keynote entitled, "We Will Be a City Upon a Hill," and ended with that phrase, or this phrase, "We are indeed, and we are today, the last best hope on earth." That's Lincoln. This sense of exceptionalism is evident in American law at home and abroad, and not entirely the possession of the right. President Bill Clinton refused in 1998 to join the 120 nations that accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court at The Hague, the court for last resort for crimes against humanity, because, he said, no foreign court should judge American citizens. When the U.S. Supreme Court fairly recently ruled in a 5-4 decision that juvenile executions were unconstitutional, making a reference to international jurisprudence, The conservatives, especially Justice Scalia, a believer in American exceptionalism, vigorously objected that such global standards are irrelevant to the United States. On the other side, on the majority side of the decision, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg reminded him that in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson made a direct reference to the obligation to win the decent respect of the opinions of mankind. Scalia is supposed to live in that part of American history. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration clearly embraced exceptionalism to justify the violation of a variety of international conventions, most important, the Hague Conventions on the treatment of military prisoners, something that, alas, is still in Guantanamo Bay. So I'm going to discuss the document of the proponents of American exceptionalism, John Winthrop's lay sermon delivered on the Ryle in Massachusetts Bay. Turn my paper upside down. A model of Christian charity was a carefully argued sermon, a quite long one, bolstered by biblical references and severe logic. But it did not make a claim for exceptionalism. Indeed, it located their experiment, their city upon a hill, as Winthrop characterized it, in relation to God, for sure, but also to the world. Only the most tendentious reading can turn it into a claim of exceptionalism. Winthrop was probably, in part, motivated by unspecified troubles on board the ship crossing the Atlantic. His sermon was a warning. It was framed in the context of God and the larger Christian community and non-believers, for that matter. Instead of a boast of exceptionalism, the key paragraph in which the phrase appears after many pages emphasizing the importance of humility in the eyes of God and in the world to live up to his commands and their own Christian professions. If read in context, which is provided in 99% of the sermon, his famous and much quoted line cannot be understood as a claim of exceptionalism. In fact, if one reads the whole sentence rather than a single phrase, one does not even need the many pages preceding to understand its meaning. We must consider, this is what he wrote, we must consider that we shall be as a city on the hill. The eyes of all people, that's crucial, are upon us. So if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, we shall be made a story and a byword around the world. So the witnesses of the world, just as Thomas Jefferson had articulated in the Declaration, was a key part of the aspirational aspect of these documents. Let me make a brief comment as well on Reagan's misrepresentation of Lincoln's line from his second inaugural, a speech identified by some literary critics to be the best prose ever written in the United States. Rather than Reagan's arrogant boast that the U.S. is the best hope on earth, Lincoln addressed the profound flaw in the United States that haunted North America from the beginning, the enslavement of millions of people. It is in fixing that flaw, in freeing the slave, for which he declares we shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. Alexis de Tocqueville is generally considered the author of an exceptionalist interpretation of American history. He does use the word one time in his 2 volumes, but it is used in a very restrictive way. And he insisted that, I quote him, he cannot consent to separate America from Europe. I consider the people of the United States as that portion of the English people who are commissioned to explore the forests of the New World. he believed that the United States emerged in momentary exceptional circumstances. Protection from Europe by an ocean without powerful nations on its borders, and it was large when territory was understood to be a resource. Indeed, Tocqueville predicted that because of the size, the United States and Russia would be the dominant powers in the 20th century. More to the point, Tocqueville did not see American history as distinct from what, for him, was a universal, he used the word providential, process that would shape European as well as American history. It is the issue of equality that is central to his great book on democracy in America. That was his focus because that was, in his mind, the face of modernity. If Marx worried about inequality and the formation of antagonistic classes, Tocqueville worried about the implications of equality. In fact, equality is the central explanatory theme in his classic study of the French Revolution. In The Old Regime and the Revolution, he argued that the roots of revolution were long, going back to Louis XIV. When Louis XIV disempowered the nobility, he undermined the hierarchical foundations of the society and the monarchy. Instead of a complex and hierarchical society, France, Tocqueville argued, became divided between the one, the monarchy, and everyone else. For Tocqueville, the United States was not exceptional or even unique. The central social condition and process was shared by France and the US. It was this global providential move toward equality. So the distinctive thing he found in the United States, he also thought was not distinctive. He thought it was a Euro-American phenomenon. In fact, he's quite explicit in the preface to the Democracy, and then for an 1848 reissue of it, an even longer argument against American exceptionalism. Yet this is one of the books that the exceptionalists continually argue. When I wrote this book, A Nation Among Nations, my intention was to turn an ideological debate that seemed endless, whether or not the United States is or is not exceptional, to an empirical question. Empirically speaking, is the United States engaged in global history just as one nation among other nations? At least to my satisfaction, I think that I had enough evidence to show that. But the other thing, as I dug into this question, is that I discovered historians for 150 years had been avoiding American exceptionalism until the World War II era. And I want to go through some of the famous historians of the United States of the 19th century. George Bancroft, the first great historian, and Francis Parkman, perhaps the most literate 19th century historian, both framed American history within the larger Atlantic world. Parkman specifically the French and the English in North America. Bancroft included all parts of Europe and even mentioned Tupac Amaru's revolt in the upper Platte region of South America. So they were looking in Atlantic-wide, at least Atlantic-wide terms. Likewise, Henry Adams, Frederick Jackson Turner, who's remembered for the frontier, but actually, as I will show in a moment, thought very much about the global framing of American history, and W.E.B. Du Bois, all used at the turn of the last century, two last centuries, the 1890s to World War I period. These Americans, Adams, Turner, Du Bois, were struck by the global interconnections in the 1880s and 1890s, and saw earlier connections as well. In 1891, 2 years before Turner gave his famous lecture on the influence of the frontier in American history, he wrote or delivered a lecture to Wisconsin school teachers on the significance of history. He says, "Not only is it true that no country can be understood without taking account of all the past, it is also true that we cannot select a stretch of land and say we will limit our study to this land, for local history can only be understood in the light of the history of the world. Each nation acts on each. Ideas, commodities even, refuse the bounds of nation. All are inextricably connected so that each is needed to explain the others. This is especially true of the modern world, with its complex commerce and means of intellectual communication. Each age must be studied in the light of all past history. Local history must be viewed in the light of world history." These cosmopolitan historians knew what they were talking about. The 1890s were the first age of modern globalization. Using the main indicator used in the 1990s for measuring the degree of globalization, that is the percentage of direct foreign investment, it is clear that the globalization was greater in the 1890s than the 1990s. And I think this is a very important thing that has helped move in our own time the thinking about a global framing of history. Okay, I'd like to now give a couple of examples of what I, a moment ago, talked about an empirical sort of argument for the absence of exceptionalism, or to put it more positively, an empirical demonstration that major events in American history were global events, or a part of larger global events, just one part. First, the age of discovery, the Columbus business. In fact, the importance of that era is less Columbus, and I understand that Columbus has been downgraded here. That's fine. The really important thing that happened then, it's something that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx agreed on, is that the global economy, global capitalism begins basically with Magellan, when it is discovered that the oceans connect all parts of the world instead of separating them. That the oceans seem to be, the Afro-Eurasian world was trapped by the ocean. The Greeks knew that that the Earth was round. They even knew exactly how many miles it was in circumference. But they said, but we can't, you could, in theory, sail west to get to the east, to India, as they named it. But the ocean's in the way. What was discovered is two things: that not only the ocean is not in the way, but the oceans are connectors. And that changed the world. I think that, I'm going to go, there's some other little examples here, but I actually want to do a big example. The commonplace account of American colonization is linear. The spatial aspects are ignored. But if we recognize that those Puritans, John Winthrop and those who landed in Massachusetts, their brother Puritans also settled at the same time, Barbados, Honduras, and an island in the Indian Ocean. That makes them look a little bit different than this hard New England world that we sort of imagine. The Dutch foundation of New Amsterdam is treated as if it was intended to be modern New York, and its racial and religious diversity of the Dutch New York is used to point out its anticipation of a modern American diversity. That line of thinking appropriates what is really a history of the global Dutch commercial empire. Ignored is the near simultaneous Dutch settlement of Batavia, that is today's Jakarta, which had far more diversity and was much more valuable. And after the Dutch lost New York to the British in 1664, 10 years later, after another Anglo-Dutch war, the Dutch had the opportunity to trade Suriname for the recovery of Manhattan. They chose to keep Suriname. Seems to be a good an odd choice now, but at the time when sugar was sweet gold, Suriname was richer and more promising. But the point is that New York was not so important at that point. While the usual account takes note of the Portuguese and Spanish empires in the Americas, it takes little account of the meaning of a world made of empires. The focus of U.S. history rather quickly shifts to the English, their contact and interactions with Native Americans. There's another really big problem with even this multinational vision of the Atlantic. It overplays the movement of Europeans to America, not because it gives inadequate treatment to Native Americans, which we're finally doing in our history books, but it assumes the Atlantic was a European space. In fact, before 1820, 5 times more Africans than Europeans made the Atlantic transit to the Americas. Not freely, but they made it, and that was the population. And the sources of New World wealth were dependent on various non-European parts of the Afro-Eurasian world, and particularly for Spain, the silver. There was so much silver in Mexico and Peru that it would have flooded the silver market and devalued it. Europe was a very primitive economy. They couldn't possibly have kept the value of silver. But lo and behold, the largest economy in the world, China, 40% of the world economy in the beginning of the 17th century. They made silver legal specie, legal tender at that point, so that is for paying taxes. At the same time, the Chinese had a very strong aesthetic preference for silver as opposed to gold or some other metals. As a result, they sustained the silver market. They consumed 50% of all the silver that came out of the New World silver mines. If it hadn't been for that, this development project might have been limited, considerably limited. Okay, now I'm going to go to 2 key events in American history. The American Revolution and the Civil War. For the American Revolution, my witness of non-exceptionalism in this instance is James Madison, father of our Constitution. In the course of the Constitutional Convention, the notes of that convention record this comment of his, which seemed to have nothing to do with the provisos of the Constitution. He says, "Carthage and Rome tore one another to pieces instead of uniting their forces to devour the weaker nations of the earth. The houses of Austria and France were hostile as long as they remained the great powers of Europe. England and France have succeeded to preeminence and to enmity. To this principle, we owe perhaps our liberty." What he is recognizing is that the war between France and England is the reason the United States came into existence. England and France had been, it used to be called the Great War until World War I became the Great War. From 1689 to 1815, there was constant war between France and England. The 7 Years' War from 1757 to 63 was the First World War. It was a war fought on every continent, and France lost territory on every continent, Africa, India, the New World. And they were a bit angry about that. That is why the French supported us in the Revolutionary War. It wasn't because Louis XVI thought that a Republican operation would be just the thing. In fact, it did reverberate back, though. The French expenditures on the war, and it's clear that the French won it. Yorktown was a French victory. Caused the already nearly bankrupt French state to finally call the Estates General into assemblage for the first time in over 150 years. And that's when things started happening. And that's what led to the revolution. Indirect, but significant. In any event, even the Tea Party, which is much spoken of in the United States today, the Tea Party people don't quite understand that the Tea Party, the Tea Act, was actually a tax cut, not a tax increase. What had happened was the Bank of England was in financial difficulties because the East India Company, which was hugely badly run and hugely in debt, could not pay the service on their debt. So the Bank of England had to start to pull in from other banks who they had loaned to see if they could cover their problem. They went to the Scottish banks. The Scottish banks were unable to help them because the American colonies were indebted, and particularly the Southern planters, and especially Thomas Jefferson, who was he just loved, he was a super consumer. In any event, they could not solve the problem that way. So what they did is they went to Parliament, and Parliament came up with an idea. Well, the East India Company has no cash, but they have hundreds of tons of tea. What if we made tea so cheap that it would be sold, and then they would be able to pay off their debt? So the tea route was that ships had to go from India to London, and there they would be taxed, and then they would go to the American colonies and be taxed again. If they cut out the expense of that extra journey to London, and they abolished the tax because they wouldn't be there to pay for it, the tea would be cheaper. So why the big fuss? Because the Boston merchants and smugglers, of which they're both the same people, this tea would undersell the smugglers. And that is where a lot of this came from. So there are some interesting kinds of connections. There's also the fact that at the same time that the King of Spain was, of England were getting attacked by the colonists for changes, not just taxes, but restructuring the empire in ways that were reducing the power of what Latin America would be called the Creoles in North America, just the people that are there. The same thing was happening. The Portuguese and Spanish empires were also reorganizing. There were changes in the Atlantic economy and relations between the colonies and the center. And there were outbreaks. There were outbreaks in Argentina, in the Upper Platte, there was in Brazil, there were in Colombia. So this whole thing was a moment in Atlantic history and the history of colonial empires. Okay, so the last example is the Civil War. The American Civil War, I would argue, is part of the larger history of 19th century liberalism, the invention of the modern nation state, and an Atlantic-wide rejection of unfree labor. 1848 was the key date. The 1848 revolutions moved Europe toward republicanism and modern states. In the United States, it was the end of the Mexican War, and the Mexican War important aspect that had to do with anti-slavery. That is a Pennsylvania Democrat introduced into Congress something called the Wilmot Proviso, that slavery would be forbidden in any lands taken from Texas. I mean, from Mexico, Texas. It's another story. We'll leave that one out. But at any event, this started the debate on slavery in real serious central ways, not just the radical abolitionists. It also deeply stirred Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was very, very closely watched the revolutions of 1848. He was a legislator in the state legislature of Illinois at that time, and he sponsored a bill celebrating Louis Kossuth, the Hungarian 1848 revolutionary. What was the 1848 revolution about? I think it was nationalism and freedom. The nation was to be the vehicle for achieving freedom. Lincoln grasped that linkage. He also understood the definition of nation that they were articulating. The nation ought to be culturally homogeneous in the sense that the boundaries of the nation ought to have a certain kind of homogeneity. For Kossuth and the Hungarians, it was language. It was Magyar. For Lincoln, and this is where the house divided speech comes, a house divided cannot stand. It had been standing since the founding of the nation. Why now? Because the nation should be homogeneous, in this case, of freedom, rather than a mixture of freedom and slavery. That notion of the nation state that emerged out of the 1848 revolutions links nation, freedom, and a certain kind of unity. This is when the United States is made into a nation. Before the Civil War, the United States was a plural. It was the United States are. After the war, it became the United States is. It became a singular noun. Abraham Lincoln, in his inaugural address, used the word union 29 times and never used the word nation. In his Gettysburg Address in 1863, an address with only 269 words, he used the word nation 5 times. His shift in what the conception was going to be was an Atlantic-wide result of the revolutions. And indeed, Argentina was into that thing too. The 1853 Constitution is a part of that whole same ideology. So this was, the United States had its own particular thing, but even on the question of the freeing of the slaves, between 1848 and 1870, 44 million unfree laborers were free. 4 million were slaves in the United States. The rest were mostly serfs in Russia, but the end of unfree labor was also marked, in which the United States played one role, but a minority role in terms of numbers. So there's a federative crisis, that is of making up a new nation state that was true, is going on in Germany, Italy, Japan, several Latin American countries, and the United States. So we're back to a notion, I think, that the history of the United States is a part of the history of a larger world, and it is not very helpful to separate that. The odd thing is, and this is the last point, is that historians have been slow, although I did name these earlier historians, that in general, the professionalization of history was professionalized around the idea that the nation state was the unit of history. That's why historians didn't study Africa. Anthropologists studied Africa until you get into really the World War II era. If they don't have archives and, quote, a literature, they aren't subjects of history. If If they don't have a nation state, they're not subjects of history. So history is bound to the nation state. This came out of Germany. It was the historical discipline in its modern form was formed there by Leopold von Ranke, the German seminar. And so that was picked up around the world. Interestingly, Ranke, as a Hegelian idealist, believed that although the nation was the focus, there was a universal history that they were a part of. That, especially for Americans who are so empirical, that just dropped out. And so we have this self-contained history. Thank you.